Okay, now we're looking at the production side. So we have our sellers here. Remember, willingness to sell, my minimum willingness to sell for each of these quantities. So remember, before I was saying, okay, give me a quantity, I'm going to tell you quantity supplied, right? $10, people are willing to supply 6. $18, people are willing to supply whatever that is. So now we're just looking at in terms of willingness to sell. So the first unit, someone is willing to sell it for $3. Second unit, someone's willing to sell for $4. So we have a willingness to sell. So just like this is the benefit side of the market, which is your demand curve, your supply curve is going to be the cost side of the market. So we can think of this as this seller, if it's a different seller, that first unit, their cost, their marginal cost of that last unit is going to be $3. And so they're willing to sell it as long as the price is at least $3. And now we're assuming that that cost is going up. So that second unit, for some reason, is more costly. And we'll see examples of this, and we'll see this in a lot more detail later. But that second unit, they're going to have to get at least $4 to sell that second unit. So this height of your supply curve is going to be the marginal cost, the extra cost of selling the next unit. And we're assuming that this marginal cost is going up. And again, we're going to see this again later on. But to sort of motivate why this might be true, so why is it that the extra cost keeps going up as we produce more of this good? So think about if we're producing oil. Well, the first place you're going to drill for oil, it's really cheap to drill, right? We're going to drill in the best place. So those first few units, it's cheap to produce. This is the cost of those first few units are going to be really low. And then once you use up that area, you're going to go drill in more expensive places, right? So because we've already taken advantage of the low cost production. So it's going to get higher and higher cost production. The marginal cost is increasing. So that's an example. Gold mining would be kind of a similar thing. Right? I'm going to mine for gold where it's cheaper to get, and then it's going to get more and more expensive. And so normally we're thinking in terms of production, but it could also be I just have a bunch of stuff to sell, and the cost is always opportunity cost. So suppose I have like 10 gallons of water, and let's just assume that that's my only water supply, so that we don't have like unlimited water supply. Well, the first gallon of water, or I have 10 gallons, so the 10th gallon, or the first one that I'm willing to get rid of, for me that opportunity cost is going to be really low, right? Because I have certain uses for water. Maybe I'll use it to wash the dishes, wash the car before, most important is going to be to drink it. But that 10th gallon I really don't have an important use for. So the opportunity cost of getting rid of that is going to be really low. Next one's going to be more valuable to me. So the opportunity cost of selling it is higher. You're going to have to give me a higher price to account for that opportunity cost. And then it gets higher and higher and higher, right? The 5th gallon, the 6th gallon is more valuable to me. So the opportunity cost of selling it is going to be higher. And so that would also give you a rising marginal cost curve. So again, we're going to look at cost in a lot more detail later on. So again, the difference, just like we had consumer surplus, we're going to have producer surplus. So now for that first unit, someone is willing to sell it for 3. We're assuming the price is 10. All the transactions happening here at the market price of $10. Well, if I was willing to sell it for 3 and I sell it for 10, I get a producer surplus of 7 for that unit, right? So now it's the price minus the willingness to sell. That distance there is going to be your producer surplus, right? Producer surplus for this unit, and we can just fill that in here. And then we have that marginal seller is just breaking even at that market price. So they're willing to sell just at $10, or that tiny little unit before that, just below $10. We're going to assume they go right up to that point just to make our graphs a little easier to work with. But you can see it, since we're allowing for very small changes, it makes no difference if I stop just short of that or to go right to that point. So we're just going to assume, let's go right to that quantity of 6, where the very last unit, that very last fractional unit, we're breaking even on that last unit. And again, so the marginal seller is right where that marginal cost is $10, and then every unit before that is getting this producer surplus here. So if we fill that in, we get consumer surplus up here, we get producer surplus up here. Now, what happens if we don't produce this market quantity of 6, this equilibrium quantity, for some reason? And we'll see why that might happen later. But if we stopped at a quantity of 4, for example, well, at 4, the marginal benefit is up here. Someone is willing to pay this amount for that 4th unit or the next unit, and someone is willing to sell it for this amount. So there's a gain from trade between buyers and sellers that aren't happening here. That's why we're losing surplus. We're not taking advantage of this surplus that might be happening. Consumers would gain if we had more transactions, they'd be getting this extra surplus. Just the next unit, think about the next unit, right? Someone's willing to pay this, producers are willing to sell it for this. There's a mutual gain from doing that transaction, and so we're losing that amount of surplus if we don't transact from 4 to 6 over here. Similarly, if for some reason we went past this quantity, then remember, this is the extra cost. The marginal cost of producing that next unit is here, and the marginal benefit, someone's willingness to pay, is down here. Well, if the cost is greater than the benefit, this is not a gain. This is actually wasteful. If your costs are greater than the benefits, which is what's happening in this part of the curve, then it'd be wasteful to transact there. And there'd be no reason for people to do it. People would not voluntarily make that trade, because the next person, remember, anyone who wants to transact is already doing it at a market price of 6, market price of 10 and a quantity of 6, and so there'd be no reason to go past this point, because the only people left have a willingness to pay down here, and the only people left to sell have a extra cost, marginal cost up here. These transactions would not happen. It'd be wasteful if for some reason these transactions were to happen. So efficiency basically means we're maximizing that total surplus. And so another way to say it is we're doing a cost benefit analysis here, because for all these transactions the benefits are here, the extra benefits are all here, the extra costs are all here, and if the benefits are greater than the cost, then we're creating that gain from trade. That's what it means to be efficient. So we're just getting a maximum, just totaling surplus. Doesn't matter whether it's consumer or producer. On this graph, looks like it's symmetrical. It doesn't have to be that way. When we start changing the shapes of our curves, it might not be symmetrical like this, but consumer plus producer surplus is total surplus. As long as we're getting the most possible surplus, that's what we mean by efficiency. So it's really just cost benefit. In other words, gains from trade. We're consuming, we're producing. We want to get the most gain possible. So notice the very first unit that gets produced in this market has very high gain from trade. Someone's willing to pay a very high amount for that, and someone's willing to sell it for a really low amount. Right? There's a big gain from making that first transaction. Right? So that this market is creating a lot of value from existing at first, and then we're going to the same thing for all of these units out to equilibrium. And now we've maximized the total possible gains from trade by just allowing this market to go out to equilibrium. And so this term is not introduced in this part of the textbook yet, but we might as well introduce it now. So we just saw what happens if I produce too little. We lost this surplus. The term for that is deadweight loss. So lost surplus from not producing enough quantity. We've lost these mutually beneficial transactions that would have created surplus. We call that deadweight loss. And the same thing if we go too far. So here this is wasteful production because the extra cost is greater than the extra benefit, and so this I guess we could call it negative surplus, but this wasteful production is also considered deadweight loss. So whenever you're not efficient, whenever you're not producing that efficient quantity, then you have deadweight loss. And so what's going to cause that? We're not getting into that yet, but as we'll see in the next chapter, price controls, taxes, externalities, which is going to be things like pollution, where it has external costs, and then markets that are not competitive. So much of the rest of micro is going to be looking at these different categories that create deadweight loss, because this whole idea of efficiency is really the benchmark of how we're looking at everything. So are we maximizing gains from trade? And if we're not, what's the reason for that? And we want to look at the analysis of what's going on there.